The emergence of a bourgeois class whose increasing wealth was based on commerce, trade, and finance was to leave the greatest legacy.
The setting here is in England, and it's in a time before the 1600s, and it's before the English had became involved in the slave trade. And so the English had been going through some cultural and some social reforms. And so the Protestant Reformation, it was sweeping through the land. And this is where people started challenging the Catholic Church's doctrine and their dependency on the popes and the priests as being middle people between them and their attaining of salvation. And so feudalism was on the decline. And feudalism is a way of structuring society where you have a king who owns all the land. And basically what he does is he allows the land to be used by various ranks of people in the society. And that's from the lords down all the way to the serfs, who are basically like slaves. And so they use the land in exchange for producing goods or offering some of their services, right? And this is a simplified view, but it's essentially what it is. And so this was the dominant social system in medieval Europe, and it was dying out and it was becoming replaced with capitalism, which is an economic-based system that allows people to act in their own interest to earn profits. And so the point of understanding this information in English culture is to get a better sense of some of the ideas that heavily influenced the way that the English approached slavery and the way that they approached the people that they encountered into what was to them known as the New World. So with that being said, let's continue in the book and see if we can get some understanding.
A largely urban middle class composed of merchants in the expanding overseas trade, financiers, bankers, shopkeepers, artisans, manufacturers, and industrialists took form, eventually creating a lifestyle of vast material consumption and challenging the gentry and nobility for influence in government.
The urban middle class merchants created a life which involved the consumption of a lot of material things. And so they had new ideas and they had new ways of interacting with the world around them. And there were people that were in the way of them manifesting these ideas. And this is why they challenged the gentry and nobility, or the people higher up in social order.
Some wealthy merchants obtained large estates, purchased royal titles such as knighthoods and baronetcies, and even married some of their offspring into the aristocratic class. An entrepreneurial spirit characterized town life, and even the younger sons of the gentry, prevented by the rule of primogeniture from inheriting their father's estates, often turned to commerce and trade and helped to provide a veneer of polish and refinement to the rough and tumble competitiveness of town life.
The younger sons of the gentry were not allowed to inherit the father's property, and that's because the inheritance went to the eldest son, right? And so the younger sons of the gentry, they started seeing opportunities elsewhere in commerce and trade.
Merchant capitalism fostered other values: individualism, absolute private property, and the unrestrained accumulation of wealth.
This is how the value of individualism, or making oneself the focus, begins to appear in recent English thinking, or appear in a dominant sense in recent English thinking, I should say. And so these people had profits and property on their mind, of which there's nothing wrong with these ideas until they're taken to the extreme swings on the pendulum, which is what we'll see happen with the English.
It was a concomitant and a cause of the breakdown of kinship and community ties, a process that had begun toward the end of the feudal period.
Feudalism isn't that appealing of a system, but one thing that it did was it tied the people together, while capitalism began severing the community ties.
Feudalism had tended to associate men with particular areas of land, the fiefs granted by the king or a noble lord to a wealthy individual for his services. Lords, villains, tenants, and serfs were bound to landed estates and to one another through personal ties. They had obligations to the land and one another. In this way, generations of kinspeople remained settled together, with tenants and serfs working the same lands.
This was the setup under the feudal system, which Dr. Audrey Smedley talks about how it began diminishing starting in the 13th century Common Era. And so the significance of kinspeople, or people related to one another, began to shrink to include much smaller families, and then it eventually just became the immediate family, or the parents and the children. And so as the feudal system began to wither away and the increase of individuals paying wages to people for their work began to boom, there was a need for men to leave their villages and family to sell their labor in other cities and towns. Or what they can do is they could join the militia. And so the atmosphere and the environment were changing into something that these people weren't used to, right? And so they needed to adjust. And many of the people who did not adjust, they simply fell into the pit.
A few men acquired the skills to participate in industry or commerce and devoted their lives to the private accumulation of wealth. The desire for personal enrichment as a major consequence of and motivation for free market ideology became a dominant cultural value.
The desire to earn profits and to obtain private property motivated the idea of supplying people with what they demanded, while excluding government from being involved in the process. This became something highly esteemed in the English culture.
Another development strengthened the importance of private property. Beginning in the 15th century, the enclosure movement had resulted in the transformation of what were once communal lands, forests, and meadows in English villages to private property, enclosed by hedges and fences and held in absolute possession by landowners whose objectives were the production of commodities for growing towns and greater profits.
Before this, the land was available to the community, where the animals could graze and roam freely. But with this new wildfire for turning a profits, the landowner said, "No sir, not today. Your animals are no longer going to graze on this land. I'm putting up a fence." Uh-oh.
When the English turned to fencing in parcels of land and the use of titles became widespread, the sense of exclusive private use of natural resources expanded and matured. Some men became very wealthy as the value of these lands increased, while others, those dispersed or dislocated by the privatization of land, were reduced to abject poverty.
And did they care about the people who had the same skin color and came from the same culture? Nope, not one bit. If you didn't make it, you just didn't make it. The wealthy folks had a tunnel vision of profits on their minds. Pay close attention to the ways of the human being.
Also of great significance was the development of the use of money in the relations of life to such an extent that it was possible to buy for money goods of any kind and to secure any variety of services. Money became the measure of all things, functioning not only as a means of exchange, but as a mode of payment and a standard of value.
Money is a very useful tool, so let's get that clear. But when it becomes the measure of all things and all standards of value, then we're dealing with extremes. And it definitely takes an extreme of ideas to do what the English ended up doing once they got involved in the slave trade.
The accumulation of money, its use and investment, became a fundamental goal of all ambitious men. Although the English church denounced the sins of usury, hoarding, and profiteering, F.C. Dietz tell us, worldly pursuits acquired an importance of their own, and the unity of all activity envisaged in the Christian view of life was broken, never to be achieved again. Gold and silver, which could buy virtually anything, totally transformed English life. The power of the church to establish and maintain ethical and moral standards had already atrophied and begun to decline before the rise of capitalism as a way of life. Thus, the pursuit of wealth by individuals was unencumbered by the demands of either kinship or any other moral order.
The pursuit of profits by people with the I, or the me mentality was not slowed down by anyone talking about being a big family or any moral code that the Christian church had established.
Over the course of several centuries, merchant capitalists involved in trading and financial institutions developed a collective power based on their wealth and investments in overseas enterprises.
This is where other wealthy merchant capitalists were starting to lock in with each other. Why? Because people get together with others that they share common interests with. And so what was their common interest? It was profits and investing in overseas businesses. Let's keep it going.
Many historians tend to agree that English culture, as manifested in its early development of a capitalist ethos, differed from most of the cultures of Western Europe, which lagged behind in their development toward industrial capitalism.
The English were on a completely different level from the rest of Western Europe when it came to making profits. They were on a different level in other areas as well, right? And so the English, when it comes, they were just different, man, in general.
Macfarlane quotes from a number of medieval sources written by foreign travelers in England that describe the extreme individualism of the English, sometimes seen as arrogance, their preoccupation with their own private interests, their overbearing pride, and their suspiciousness not only of strangers but also of one another. Combined with their self-confidence and arrogance went a mutual suspiciousness. Each individual was out for himself and trusted no one else, Macfarlane paraphrases. Foreign observers often spoke of English wealth, abundance of food, fine clothes, love of freedom and independence, pursuit of money and trade, and lack of affection for their children. All these writers, Macfarlane notes, clearly felt that there was something different not only about the economy, but also the personality of the English.
So now up to this point, the English have gravitated towards new ideas of capitalism, individuality, and private property, all which have modified their culture and have shaped the way that they viewed themselves and the world around them. And so you have to understand that people's ideas that they believe in their mind impact the way that they act in the real world. And as I said earlier, the point of understanding this shift in English thinking, it's important because along with other influences, it influenced the way that the English approached the situation that they found themselves in when they came colonizing the Americas. And so knowing this history provides some additional insight.
If the English were perceived as culturally distinct by their European contemporaries long before the age of exploration and conquest, surely these cultural traits uniquely influenced the nature and quality of their colonial experiences. English ideologies about individualism and accumulating property guided their assault on foreign lands and their treatment of the indigenous peoples of the New World.
Me, want that property that you're on right now. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get it, even if that means breaking all the treaties and promises and then turning you into a savage. Because you've got it and I have got to have it.
These ideologies also helped to determine the kind of slavery that evolved in North America. Possessive individualism and the near sacredness of property and property rights in 17th century English culture facilitated the transformation of Africans into slave property and their concomitant demotion to non-human forms of being.
Can you imagine the thought materials that these people had in their minds which aided them in creating the idea of turning humans into property? Right? This is a crazy advanced idea, right? And it's not just an idea that they kept in the world of imagination. It was something that they made manifest in the real world, right? And so they must have continually been thinking about profits, property, domination, rulership, and other related subjects for this idea to flash in their minds. Like, oh, you know what? Let's turn these people into pieces of property, right? And then demote them to something less than a human being. These are some wild ideas, right? These are head shakers. And so hopefully you've got some understanding and you can use some of this information to climb out of the pit and enter the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so this is the end of part 4 commentary on the book here, Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on the other side.